All right. Hello. How is everyone tonight? Where the hell are my captions? Why are they not showing up? Again. They shouldn't be timed. They're not timed out. So what the hell's going on? Sound's working. It's saying that it's too quiet. I don't know. So what I gotta do here, man? How's that? Is that gonna work now? Yes. All right. I don't know. Twitch has been just absolutely screwed up all week. I can't export my videos like I normally do. I have to download them and then upload them manually to YouTube. I can't always change the name and category that I'm streaming in. Sometimes that just doesn't work. I haven't been able to raid all week. I don't know what's going on, but they need to get their shit together. All right, so one moment. We are on to chapter 3 of Atlantis and the Kingdom of the Neanderthals by Colin Wilson. And hopefully he's going to get into a bit more of his theory and not this narrative of his travel, because I don't know about you, but I don't find that nearly as exciting as the theory itself. So, got a lot of book left to go, though, so hopefully he gets beyond the narrative. All right. Ancient Technologies. The last chapter of Hapgood's Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings is called A Civilization That Vanished, and it begins by repeating the author's conviction that the ancient maps suggest the existence in remote times before the rise of any of the known cultures of a true civilization, a worldwide culture. Hapgood then wrote a word of warning. Quote, "When I was a youth, I had a plain, simple faith in progress. It seemed to me impossible that once man had passed a milestone of progress in one way, that he could ever pass the same milestone again the other way. Once the telephone was invented, it would stay invented. If past civilizations had faded away, it was just because they had not learned the secret of progress. But science meant permanent progress with no going back. This process would go on forever." End quote. The ancient maps, however, had taught him otherwise. He said progress can go backwards. Ancient knowledge can be forgotten. My trip down the Nile taught me the same thing, that the ancient Egyptians knew far more about certain things than we do now, and that most of this knowledge has been forgotten. The archaeologist Flinders Petrie stumbled upon a puzzling example in the 1890s, excavating a village called Naquada on the Nile. He found pottery and vases of such sophistication that he decided they probably dated from the 11th dynasty, about 2000 BC, which is 500 years later than the Great Pyramid. Since there was no sign of such people in dynastic history, he coined the term new race to describe them. Excuse me. But when he found the same pottery in tombs dating some 3000 BC, he decided to drop Naquata from his chronology rather than face the embarrassment of trying to explain how primitives could produce such fine ceramics. A similar problem was encountered in the long-necked vases found in the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, built around 2650 BC. The vases had been carved out of crystalline materials such as quartz, diorite, or basalt. Archaeologists were puzzled by how craftsmen had carved the insides of the vases. Such craftsmanship would require not only a long drill to reach down the neck, which was too narrow to fit a child's finger, but also an instrument to cut out the inside with delicate precision. We are forced back to the improbable hypothesis that the craftsman had some method of softening the crystal to the consistency of clay, or perhaps of melting it like glass. The ancient Egyptians clearly had technology that has since been lost. In 1957, Hapgood was called in to give advice on a very similar problem, the mystery of the Libyan desert glass. This glass had come to light a quarter of a century earlier in December 1932 when two Englishmen were driving along a sand-free corridor in the desert, which is actually in Egypt. They were Patrick Andrew Clayton and the Egyptian Desert Survey and Professor Leonard Spencer, the keeper of minerals in the British Museum. As they were driving, they noticed the glitter of shining objects on the ground. These objects proved to be beautiful pieces of glass, which ranged from the size of a pea to the size of an egg. Spencer assumed they were tektites, a kind of glass that probably arrives on Earth in the form of meteorites. The puzzling thing, however, was that the tektites were on the surface, which seemed odd since a meteor would bury itself in the sand. The scientists collected about 100 weight of this beautiful substance, valued by Arab craftsmen for making jewelry, and took it back to Cairo. Closer examination revealed just how strange their find was. Some of the pieces had fractures that looked as if they had been produced deliberately, like the flakes of flint found near prehistoric hand axes. What was also odd was their sheer quantity. Tektites are relatively rare, not found by the hundredweight. Chemical analysis proved they were not tektites, but were made of the same silicon as the desert sand. But what had melted it? There was no sign of a crater. One interesting piece of evidence suggested a strange alternative. One fragment, about the size of a lemon, had a neat hole running right through it, looking as if someone had poked it with a metal rod while it was still molten. Two other boreholes, he has in quotes, penetrated the glass for only a short distance. So it looked as if the glass had been made by human hands. The few bubbles in it were elongated, as if the glass had been turned while it was still molten. When Clayton and Spencer presented their evidence to the Royal Geographical Society in 1933, one member of the audience was particularly interested. He was Francis James Rennell, who later became Lord Rennell of Rhodes, as well as President of the Royal Geographical Society. He had been a staff officer in Egypt during the First World War, and later been involved in Sahara exploration. He was fascinated by the mystery of the Libyan desert glass. What kind of men had manufactured it? Rock carvings in the area dated to about 5500 BC. It had been assumed that the artists had been nomads, but if they had made the glass, then there must have been a fairly sophisticated level of civilization in this area in the 6th millennia BC. In the late 50s, Reynolds spoke of the mystery to Dr. John R. V. Dolphin, the chief engineer of the British Atomic Energy Authority, and Dolphin remarked that he had seen something similar in the Australian desert, but he knew just how it had been created, by an atomic bomb test. Dolphin showed some of the Australian glass to Lord Reynolds, who agreed it looked astonishingly like the Libyan desert glass. Like the Libyan specimen, Dolphin's Australian glass contained virtually no water because of the tremendously high temperature at which it had been formed. Dolphin thought about 6,000 degrees Celsius. Excuse me. That added another dimension to the mystery. Colored glass was one of the preoccupations of the alchemists, and alchemy was studied in Greco-Roman Egypt as well as ancient India and China, but would alchemical experiments have produced such quantities? Or could the glass have been the byproduct of some industrial process? That seemed to suggest that the predecessors of the ancient Egyptians possessed something like atomic power. Could it have got out of hand and caused an explosion? Lord Reynolds took this suggestion seriously, for he himself was in possession of a necklace of pure gold from ancient Egypt. It is impossible to make pure gold by any normal metallurgical process, because it is impossible to remove all the impurities. Gold can be made nowadays by a chemical process that was unknown in the ancient world. Another method of production these days involves heating the gold until it vaporizes like liquor in a still and then is allowed to cool, leaving behind its impurities. But this method, again, requires immensely high temperatures. Industrial processes requiring high temperatures need lots of water, and the Libyan desert is waterless. But has the desert always been so dry? Reynolds, and we know it hasn't, but that's an aside. Reynolds contacted an expert on such matters, Charles Hapgood, in 1957, for Hapgood was also a member of the Royal Geographical Society. Hapgood was able to assure Reynolds that in 5500 BC plenty of water existed in what is now the Sahara Desert. For several thousand years after the last pole displacement, which occurred around 10,000 BC, the Sahara Desert was green and had many lakes. Some of the Saharan rock carvings from that time depict cattle and herdsmen. The observations of Reynolds and Dolphin fit more comfortably with the conclusions Hapgood was reaching through his study of the Portolans. If man was building ocean-going vessels in 5000 BC, then he possessed a civilization capable of that level of expertise and could also easily have designed other sophisticated technological products. Besides, Hapgood had himself seen a necklace of pure gold, although it had come from Mexico, not Egypt. And Captain Arlington Mallory, who had taken part in the Georgetown panel broadcast of 1956, mentioned earlier in this book, about the Piri Reis map, had also made some astonishing claims. Mallory had excavated a number of furnaces in Ohio and Virginia, and as a result was certain that iron smelting techniques were in use before 4000 BC. And the ancient Egyptians, Mallory declared, were using tremendously high temperatures, which they obtained, quote, by the same processes that made the atom bomb possible, end quote. Mallory was convinced that 5,000 years ago the Egyptians were using the same fission process that scientists have thought was a new discovery in the 20th century. But Hapgood was skeptical about the atomic power theory. He had heard about an unknown people whose civilization was now under the sea off the coast of Ecuador, who knew all about optics and had made lenses and prisms to focus the sun's rays. Concave mirrors can be used to concentrate the sun's rays. Archimedes devised huge metal mirrors to set alight the Roman galleys besieging Syracuse in 211 BC. Robert Temple would devote a book entitled The Crystal Sun to the subject of ancient lenses made long before man was supposed to have discovered them. So it was Hapgood's view that the ancients may well have learned the secret of creating very high temperatures, but using lenses, not atomic energy. An interesting footnote in this curious story has since been provided by Dr. Farouk El-Baz of Boston University. Dr. El-Baz had traveled in Egypt's western desert, 300 miles to the west of Cairo, and had been fascinated by its strange natural pyramids. Dozens of great triangular rocks rising from the flat desert plain. It struck him that these natural pyramids might well have inspired the pyramids of dynastic Egypt. He noted that the winds in the western desert blow from the north, the Mediterranean, so the desert sand could not have been carried there by wind. Since it was made of sandstone, it must have come from the south. How? It had to be by water, rivers. But where were the rivers in this great dry waste? Now it happened that Dr. El-Baz had been the director of lunar planning on the Apollo space program during the 1967 and 1972. Oh, between 67 and 72. So he was able to call NASA to his aid. In 1994, he arranged for the orbiting space shuttle to use radar to penetrate the sea of sand. The resulting photographs amazed him. They showed that the area had been covered with a vast network of rivers that dated back 50 million years, some of them 12 miles wide. Here was proof that this great desert had once been green and lush. Research by the University of Rome geologist Fakhri Hassan around a dry lake bed revealed evidence of primitive human dwellings dating back 10,000 years, to the end of the last ice age. We know that at this time there was plenty of rain all the years round. 2,000 years later, circa 6000 BC, the rain fell only in summer. 3,000 years after that, at about the time that dynastic Egypt came into being, the great drought began. El-Baz thinks it was due to some variation in the sun's energy, but when the Great Pyramid was built, the Giza Plateau was still green. What we do not know, of course, is what degree of civilization was achieved by these dwellers around the lake in what is now the western desert. But at least we know that the conditions for civilization existed thousands of years before dynastic Egypt. They even set up standing stones for astronomical purposes thousands of years before Stonehenge. Does this explain the paradox noted by John West in Serpent in the Sky? That the science, medicine, and mathematics of Khufu's Egypt had achieved a level of sophistication that seemed inexplicable for a culture that was little more than 500 years old? A few weeks before Joy and I had set out on our trip down the Nile, I had come across yet another possible solution to the mystery of the Libyan desert glass. I was in Toronto at the Waterfront Literary Festival, where I met an acquaintance of Rand's. I think that's Rand Flemath. Was that what his last name was? Uh, an acquaintance of Rand's named Sean Montgomery, who was obsessed by scientific anomalies. Sean had heard about an even simpler method of producing very high temperatures. This had been discovered by a Bulgarian who had called himself Yul Brown, and who had spent his last years in California, where Sean had been to visit him. Brown had invented a kind of welding torch which burned a mixture of hydrogen and oxygen, which could vaporize metals. Sean had seen one in action. It belonged to a professor named Andrew Mikrowski in Ottawa. Mikrowski lit the flame, which came from a small nozzle with a spark. Brown had told Sean that the flame would instantly poke a hole in wood or metal. Montgomery held out a wooden spoon. There was a hiss of yellow flame, and a small, clean hole appeared through half an inch of wood. Mitrowski handed Sean the welding torch and told him to feel the temperature of the nozzle. Nervously, Sean touched it an inch from the flame. To his surprise, it was merely warm. Sean picked up a rod of welder's tungsten and applied the flame to it. The tungsten burned like a piece of magnesium ribbon. It should have become too hot to hold, yet even when the white flame was within an inch of Sean's fingers, there was no heat. When Sean tried playing the flame on his forearm, moving it back and forth, again it felt merely warm. It would burn tungsten at 6,000 degrees Celsius, but did little harm to flesh. Mitrowski showed Montgomery what the generator was capable of. Played on a piece of brick, the flame caused it to glaze, then began to melt. They welded a piece of glass to a piece of copper, then cut holes in a fire brick designed to withstand high temperatures, and welded copper to it. They turned a fistful of sand into a glass ball, welded together various dissimilar metals, and turned metals into molten pools. But how did it work? Mitrowski admitted he did not know and said that neither did anyone else, and this was why scientists had ignored Brown's gas, the name the inventor gave his mixture of hydrogen and oxygen. Back in Toronto, Sean and a friend ordered a Brown's gas generator from China, the only country that manufactured them. It was the largest they could afford, the same size as Mitrowski's, and the flame was only as big as the tip of a pencil. But it was obvious that it worked, even if it did seem to contradict the laws of nature. Who was the magician who had created this extraordinary machine? Bulgarian Yule Brown's real name was Ilya Velbov. He was born at Easter in 1922. Intended for the priesthood, he had become a student in a seminary. Reading the second epistle of St. Peter, he had been struck by the warning that one day the earth would be consumed by fire, and he found himself wondering how a planet whose surface is mostly water could be consumed by fire. Not long after that, reading Jules Verne's The Mysterious Island, he was fascinated by the remark that in the future the energy needs of the human race will be met by splitting hydrogen and oxygen in water. Water will be the coal of the future, quote unquote. During the war, Velbov was in the army and ended in Moscow. Denounced by his wife for his hatred of communism, he spent 6 years in a hard regime concentration camp. When he escaped into Turkey, he was again arrested and spent the next 5 years in a Turkish jail. He was released with the aid of the U.S. intelligence officer called Brown, and he changed his own name to Brown in his honor. He called himself Yule because he admired Yul Brynner. And he went to Sydney, Australia, qualified as an electrical engineer, and became head of testing in an instruments company. After 10 years, he retired. He tired of being an employee and set up on his own as an inventor. He gave his attention to the idea of turning water into fuel. It was dangerous because when hydrogen and oxygen are mixed, they become highly explosive. He wrecked his laboratory and came close to losing his life. It is, of course, easy enough to separate hydrogen and oxygen in water by electrolysis, but it takes more electricity to do this division than can be gained by recombining the two gases in an explosion. Brown's major insight came when he realized that if hydrogen and oxygen are allowed to mix in exactly the same proportion as in water, they are, so to speak, glad to recombine and do so without an explosion. This discovery was the secret of Brown's welder. The two gases implode instead of explode. They do so with almost no heat. The result is a welding flame that burns at a temperature a little more than boiling water. How can a flame of that temperature cause a tungsten rod to burn? We can only guess that the hydrogen-oxygen flame somehow enters into a chemical combination with the tungsten. The atoms of the hydrogen and oxygen are in their original state as single atoms, not combined into molecules of O2 and H2. but it is not clear why single atoms rather than molecules should make a substance like tungsten behave so unaccountably. In another later discovery, Brown showed that Brown's gas will completely detoxify nuclear waste. Interesting. Two American businessmen, Bob Zalkich and David Ennis, were excited by Brown's demonstrations. As far as the men could see, there was no reason why Brown's gas should not create an energy revolution. They thought it would be easy to design a car engine that ran on Brown's gas instead of on gasoline or diesel fuel, a considerably cheaper method than using oil-based fuels. Yet Zalkich and Ennis were unable to raise the $100 million required to exploit the energy possibilities of Brown's gas. For a while, the United States military showed some interest, but withdrew when Brown said that, as a pacifist, he was not interested in its military applications. When it began to look as if Brown's discoveries were destined to be ignored, the Chinese People's Republic made him an offer. The Chinese saw the most useful application of Brown's gas to be its implosive properties. When ignited, its volume reduced by the proportion of 1860 to 1, and as a result, the implosion could create an instantaneous vacuum. This fact, in turn, meant that the technique could be used to turn seawater into fresh water, because when warm seawater is placed in a total vacuum, it turns into steam, and its salt and other chemicals are left behind. The steam can then be drawn off with an extractor fan and condensed to make pure drinking water. In the late 1980s, Brown went to Beijing and was invited to take up residence in the research city of Baotou. I know that's not right. In Inner Mongolia, where he was provided with a laboratory. Brown set up shop at a complex known as Institute 52, with a staff of 20 specialists. Shortly after that, the Northern Industrial Company began to manufacture Brown's gas generators. Even in China, Brown was still anxious to make his invention accessible to Americans. After lengthy bargaining with the Chinese political authorities, Brown secured an agreement to allow an American company to distribute Brown's gas generators throughout the world. The Americans and the Chinese were to pay an investment cost of $1 million between them. But the deal fell through because although the Chinese advanced their share, the Americans failed to keep their part of the bargain. In spite of the breakdown of the agreement and the suspicion it raised in the minds of the Chinese, Brown continued working at Baotou. The result was that Chinese submarines began to go out to sea with Brown's gas generators instead of huge tanks of fresh water, and Chinese scientists began disposing of their nuclear waste. Brown returned to the United States in 1992, still hoping to persuade the Americans, whom he now regarded as his fellow countrymen, to invest in his ideas. Why he was unable to do so was incomprehensible to those who went to his laboratory to see his demonstrations, for the idea of using water as fuel seemed as commercial as any other great inventions, from the steam engine to television. But then these inventions had also met with obstacles. Sean Montgomery began to understand some of these obstacles when he went to meet Yule Brown in California in April 1996. He drove down from Vancouver, took a hotel room in Los Angeles, and telephoned Brown, as he had been instructed to do. To his surprise, Montgomery was met with a tirade of broken English and incomprehensible anger. Finally, Brown's girlfriend, Terry York, got to the phone, and although equally indignant, she spoke English well enough to understand Montgomery when he said he had nothing to do with some person doing experiments in Toronto, the man who turned out to be the real focus of Brown's anger. Excuse me. The experimenter had been using a plastic container as the implosion chamber, contrary to all Brown's instructions. It seemed that hydrogen atoms could leak through the plastic walls, and in doing so upset the precise mixture and rendered it potentially lethal. Once this problem was sorted out, Sean drove to a Los Angeles suburb where he finally met Yule Brown. The door was answered by an attractive, well-groomed woman of about 70, and behind her came Brown, bald, bespectacled, short, about 5'4", and portly. Shortly after, while seated in a comfortable, middle-class sitting room, Montgomery listened to his host describe his invention. Brown's words were not easy to follow since his accent was a mixture of Bulgarian consonants and Australian vowels. He talked quietly and often mumbled, but it was clear that he loved to explain his ideas, and that he was a teacher at heart. Soon the two men were bent over the table in their shirt sleeves, a growing pile of notes and diagrams between them, while Brown chain-smoked furiously. In the kitchen afterwards, as Terry York made tea, she told Sean about some of the problems that had made life with the professor so stressful. Quote, "I learned," Montgomery said later, "that Brown is a very frustrated man. Unfortunately, and as usual in cases like this, he is his own worst enemy." End quote. Terry described how Brown had finally received the offer he had been waiting for from a large American corporation that could market his invention and make him wealthy. They both expected it to fall through, as similar American offers had in the past. Again and again there had been lively interest in his work, until it reached a certain level within the hierarchy of a company, when it would be quite abruptly cut off. Both Brown and Terry expected this to happen again, but it didn't. On the contrary, the company provided what the Chinese had provided, a laboratory and an industrial facility to develop the gas. Brown's problems seemed to be over at last. On the day Brown moved in as chief of research, the company held a celebration in his honor, after which the staff went to the laboratory to show him what they had created for him. As they approached the door of the laboratory, everyone became aware of the billowing smoke of Brown's eternal cigar. Everyone looked embarrassed. No one wanted to be the first to tell this great inventor that there were strict smoking laws that applied especially to areas like this, and that insurance and the fire code demanded complete compliance. To everyone's relief, Brown squeezed it out and crushed it beneath his shoe. They entered the lab. Everyone was eager for his reaction, for it was, so to speak, an inventor's paradise. But as soon as they were inside, Brown took out another cigar and lit up. Finally, with deep embarrassment, someone had to tell him that smoking was not allowed. Brown looked incredulous. The boss was not allowed to smoke in his own laboratory? They explained awkwardly that this was not a company rule, but the law of the land. But, said Brown, he had to smoke. He could not work without smoking. Desperately, they suggested that he should step outside for a smoke. He replied that with him there was no such thing as a smoking break, because he chain-smoked all the time he was awake. He could not think clearly without smoking, and without cigars or cigarettes he would be useless to the staff. It was an impasse. No one could believe that within sight of the objective he had struggled for years to achieve, Brown would refuse to compromise. They did not know Yule Brown. He turned and walked out. That moment was the end of his dream. Sean Montgomery's theory is that Brown's extreme stubbornness, his refusal to yield an inch, was due to his years as a prisoner of the Russians and of the Turks. He had determined that once he was free, he would never again obey an order unless he wanted to. Possibly the fact that prison guards had stubbed out cigarettes on his skin made him particularly stubborn about cigarettes. At all events, his tobacco habit, what a friend called his arrogant addiction, was one of the reasons that when he died in March 1998, the general public had still never heard of Yule Brown. Montgomery's reaction to Brown's experiments was that he was witnessing something akin to alchemy. we can see why. If a flame that burns at around 135 degrees centigrade can punch holes in a fire brick and vaporize tungsten, then the laws of nature are, at the very least, not as straightforward as we assumed. It looks as if the Brown's gas flame can somehow take into account the substance it is heating, and that sensitivity sounds more like medieval alchemy than the chemistry we were taught at school. How long do we have to get through this? Holy shit. Okay. I'm on page 50, and there are 61 pages, so 11 more to go. These are long chapters. My voice doesn't like these. But we will carry on. The same might be said of the gas's ability to detoxify nuclear waste, which Brown demonstrated repeatedly. Brown would melt a piece of radioactive Americanium-241 on a brick with small pieces of steel and aluminum. Quote, after a couple of minutes under the flame, says Christopher Bird, the molten metals sent up an instant flash in what Brown said is the reaction that destroys the radioactivity. The Americanum, which had originally measured 16,000 curies of radiation per minute, now showed only 100 curies per minute, or about the same harmless low-level radiation as the background. How is it possible that Brown's gas flame produces a chemical reaction? An ordinary flame burns by heating the substance until its elements dissociate. This reaction is what happens when you apply a match to a piece of paper. On the other hand, if you mix sulfur and iron filings, then heat them over a flame in a metal tray, the sulfur will melt and turn brown, then will begin to fizz and bubble. You can remove the heat, and the reaction will continue until, instead of sulfur and iron, you have a solid lump of iron sulfide. Again, if sulfur dioxide and oxygen are passed over heated platinized asbestos, they combine to form sulfur trioxide, which, when dissolved in water, makes sulfuric acid. The platinized asbestos is a catalyst. That is, it is not changed by the reaction. Again, this sounds like alchemy. Certainly the kind of alchemy that takes place when tungsten vaporizes when heated with a mere 135-degree flame. In other words, Brown's gas may simply cause tungsten, fire brick, gold ore, radioactive waste, or other substances to react like the sulfur and iron filings, combining in an essentially chemical reaction as straightforward as dropping a piece of zinc into hydrochloric acid and watching it dissolve. If so, then the essence of Brown's gas is simply that it causes chemical reactions. This would explain why it is possible to hold one end of a piece of tungsten as it burns. The discovery makes it altogether more believable that the ancients knew the secret of Brown's gas. Much evidence points in this direction. In June 1936, a German archaeologist named William Koenig from the Iraq Museum in Baghdad was opening a Parthian grave when he came upon a clay vessel containing a copper cylinder. The cylinder, held in place by asphalt and molten lead, was an what? The cylinder held in place by was an okay. That's a misworded sentence. The cylinder held in place by asphalt and molten lead was an iron rod. Okay, it looked to Koenig like a primitive battery. I think what they're trying to say, but it's a poorly worded sentence, is There's a copper cylinder with an iron rod in the center, and they're held apart and held in the pot by asphalt and molten lead. But anyway, fellow archaeologists disputed his findings, since the grave was dated to about 250 BC. But Dr. Arne Egbrecht constructed a duplicate of the primitive battery and poured fruit juice into it. The result was a half-volt current that lasted for 18 days, with which Egbrecht was able to coat a silver figurine in gold in half an hour. He did this because he had observed that on many gold-covered Egyptian statues, the gold seemed to be too fine to have been glued or beaten on. Egbrecht became convinced that the ancient Egyptians knew the secret of electroplating. A century earlier, in 1837, when Colonel Howard Weiss was exploring the Great Pyramid, he instructed one of his assistants, J.R. Hill, to use gunpowder to unblock the end of the southern air shaft from the king's chamber. The result was that Hill found an iron plate, a foot long, 4 inches wide, and an eighth of an inch thick, embedded in the masonry at the far end of the air shaft. When scientists at the Mineral Resources Department of Imperial College in London examined the plate in 1989, they found that the plate's iron had been smelted at a temperature of over 1,000 degrees centigrade. In spite of the claims of Captain Arlington Mallory, the ancient Egyptians were not supposed to know about smelting iron. All the iron they possessed supposedly came from meteorites, but the plate was not meteoric iron. It contained too much nickel. So it would seem that the Egyptians knew about smelting iron ore 2,000 years before the Iron Age. Oddly enough, Hill found traces of gold on one side of the iron plate, indicating that it had been gold-plated. The gold may, of course, have been beaten onto the plate, but if Egbrecht was correct about his statues, the iron may have been electroplated. No one has ever explained how the walls of Egyptian tombs were illuminated as they were decorated. No sign of lamp black exists on the ceilings. Perhaps the artists went to the trouble of cleaning off any carbon. On the other hand, engravings that look oddly like electric lights and insulators are present on the walls of the temple at Dendera. Now, if the Egyptians had possessed a technology even as rudimentary as the Baghdad battery, they would have been able to dissociate the hydrogen and oxygen in water by electrolysis, and would have possessed the basic tool to create Brown's gas. When Sean Montgomery interviewed Yul Brown in April 1996, Brown told him that the Aztecs had a means of producing Brown's gas. According to Brown, Aztecs had a particular mixture of wet wood and dry wood, which they set alight. The fire caused a high temperature that caused the imprisoned steam to dissociate and become Brown's gas. It would, of course, implode in the fire, but according to Brown, this implosion would cause gold ore, presumably also trapped in the burning wood, to yield 10 times as much gold as in the normal separation process. According to Brown, quote, they were producing a lot of gold, but they couldn't have produced that much gold from the amount of ore that they were producing. I was experimenting with this matter, and I found out why. Now, with Brown's gas, you can produce 10 times more gold with the same amount of ore, end quote. Montgomery asked if Brown had done his experiment himself, and Brown replied, "Oh yes, there are even some Mayans who use this in the production of gold. They have examined it and done the lab work and conclude that this technique works, not only for making gold, but platinum, silver, and so on." When we recall Lord Reynolds' pure gold necklace and the pure gold Mexican necklace seen by Hapgood, it is natural to wonder whether These items might have been products of Brown's gas. Sean asked if there would be any way of using Brown's gas to make tektites. Brown said yes, the idea was possible. Quote, I have already sent 2 Brown's gas machines to Texas Instruments to purify silica to make silicon chips, Brown said. If you put any gas that has a hydrocarbon product to melt the silica, carbon contaminates and destroys the pure crystalline structure of the chip. But with Brown's gas, it melts the silica and leaves only water, which is near to the crystallization and creates only an ideal crystal. This gives a superior high-speed chip and also a good solar cell. Sean found himself speculating on the notion of a huge sheet of purified silicon in a sunny environment, perhaps the Libyan desert, and of using it to produce vast quantities of cheap electricity. But silicon, of course, is not quite the same thing as Libyan desert glass that looks as if it had been made in an atomic explosion. There are other clues. In the spring of 1997, I was in Mexico making the television documentary based on From Atlantis to the Sphinx. We spent a day at the ancient site of Tula, once called Tolan, 50 miles north of Mexico City. This was once the capital of the Toltecs, the predecessors of the Aztecs, whose empire flourished from about 700 to 900 AD, although they date from the pre-Christian era. The significance of Tolan is that it is, according to legend, the site of the final battle between 2 gods, Quetzalcoatl and Tezcatlipoca, usually identified as the forces of good and evil, although the Toltecs would have felt that is an oversimplification. Quetzalcoatl, who is identified with Viracocha, Kontiki, Votan, and other gods of Central and South America, is the white god who came from the east at some remote epoch. In my book, I had cited the views of the 19th century Mayan scholar Brasseur de Bourbourg, who believed that Quetzalcoatl was an Atlantis survivor who brought with him the arts of civilization. According to legend, he was finally defeated by Tezcatlipoca, the lord of the smoking mirror, which, like some magic crystal, conferred vision of distant places, and sailed away on a raft with a promise that he would one day return. This explains why I was so interested in Tula. There was where this final battle took place. I had also been greatly intrigued by a passage in Graham Hancock's Fingerprints of the Gods, which speaks of the curious objects held by the 4 great statues of Tula. These stone figures, 16 feet tall, stand on a platform at the top of a truncated pyramid, the Temple of the Morning Star, and once supported the temple's wooden roof. In 1880, the discoverer of the sacred site, the French explorer Désiré Charnay, found some blocks of black basalt that he thought to be the feet of giant statues, which he called Atlantes, from which we can deduce that he also accepted the legend of Atlantean origin. The 4 great statues of Tula were discovered 60 years later, and the name was transferred to them. The odd thing about these statues is the objects they hold in their hands, which are pressed flat against their sides. No one has ever worked out what these are supposed to be. The object on the right-hand side looks at first like a Western gunfighter's 6-shooter in its holster, and the barrel sticking out of the bottom of the holster, but the handle by which the object is held, by 2 fingers, looks more like the handle of some power tool. In the left hand, there is something that scholars have described as a bunch of arrows and an incense bag, but since the parallel strands are curved, they cannot possibly be arrows. Graham Hancock remarks that he got the feeling that the original devices were made out of metal. I was so intrigued by these that I got Joy to take photographs of them. When examined back at home, they still failed to yield any clue as to their purpose. It was certainly impossible to see how they might have been used as atlatls or spear throwers, as many of the guidebooks state. Later, Sean Montgomery drew my attention to a passage about Tula in a book by Zechariah Sitchin, The Lost Realms, the fourth volume of the Earth Chronicles series, which we are going to read that series. Maybe not all at once, but we are going to read that series. Among respectable scholars, Sitchin's is not a name to conjure with, for he is often associated with Eric von Daniken as someone who believes that the Earth was once colonized by visitors from outer space. Sitchin argues on the basis of Sumerian text that these visitors, whom he calls Anunnaki, came to Earth from a 12th planet of the solar system, Nibiru, nearly 500,000 years ago, and created human beings as their servants. But Sitchin differs from Daniken in an important respect, the sound basis of his scholarship. Whether or not we find his theories tenable, he is an endless mine of scholarly information, and in The Lost Realms, he discusses the statues of Tolan and points out that one of the pilasters has a peculiar carving of a man wearing a segmented suit with what looks like a kind of backpack. In his hands he is holding the same tool, the one that resembles a pistol in its holster, and is pointing it at the rock face in front of him. A surging flame is bursting out of the barrel of the pistol, Sitchin says. He uses it as a flamethrower to shape stone. He points out that thermojet torches were used to carve the monument of George's Stone Mountain. Whether or not thermojet torches can be used to carve stone, there is no doubt whatever that Brown's gas could be used for this purpose, and whether or not we discuss this possibility as too far-fetched, the fact remains that the strange objects held by the gods of Tolan are devices from which curving tongues of flame issue forth. It would seem that the Toltecs must either have possessed some technology or at least known enough about it to ascribe it to their gods. Most gods in world mythology can hurl thunderbolts, but I can think of no other who is depicted holding some kind of flame-spitting welding torch in his hands. Sitchin has even more interesting things to say about Tolan. It seems that the pyramid was again excavated in the 1940s by the archaeologist Jorge Acosta, who also excavated Teotihuacan. It was Acosta who found a deep trench inside the pyramid with the 16-foot Atlanteans in it. There were also 4 columns, which had once stood in the corners of the roof. An earlier pyramid lay under the Temple of the Morning Star. There were the remains of inner chambers and passages, which have still not been explored, and there was a carved stone pipe in sections that fit together with a diameter of about 18 inches. It was at the same angle as the pyramid and ran throughout its whole height. Acosta assumed it had been intended to drain water, but as Sitchin asks, why carve an elaborate stone pipe when a clay pipe would do just as well? The stone pipe was obviously part of the structure of the pyramid. Pause. Obviously part of the structure of the pyramid and a part of its purpose. Sitchin says, quote, the fact that the remains of the adjoining multi-chambered and multi-storied buildings suggest some industrial processing, and also the fact that in antiquity water from the Tula River was channeled to flow by these buildings, raise the possibility that at this site, as at Teotihuacan, some kind of purification and refining process had taken place at a very early period. Such notions bring to mind the speculations of John Dolphin and Lord Rennell about the possibility that the Libyan desert glass was a byproduct of some industrial process. Sitchin goes even further. Quote, was the enigmatic tool a tool not to engrave stones, but to break up stones for their ores? Was it, in other words, a sophisticated mining tool? And was gold the mineral sought after? End quote. Why gold? Because Sitchin argues that the purpose of the space visitors was to mine Earth for precious minerals, the most important being gold, which they needed for scientific purposes. He quotes reports of the Anglo-American corporation who engaged archaeologists to study ancient mines to the effect that, quote, mining technology was used in southern Africa during much of the period subsequent to 100,000 BC, end quote. And he points out that although in Peru and Mexico gold was obtained by panning in streams, quote, this could in no way account for the immense treasures of these countries, end quote. He quotes a Spanish chronicler to the effect that the Spaniards extracted from the Incas alone 6 million ounces of gold and 20 million ounces of silver annually. He believes, as does Yule Brown, that they had some far more efficient method of extracting precious metals from the ore. He goes on to point out that the 4 Atlanteans holding up the roof of the Temple of the Morning Star bring to mind the ancient Egyptian belief that the 4 sons of Horus hold up the sky at 4 cardinal points, and these same 4 gods would accompany the deceased pharaoh up a stairway to heaven, depicted in hieroglyphs as a kind of step pyramid. This same step pyramid symbol, which decorates the walls around the Tolan pyramid, also became a major symbol for the Aztecs, the conquerors who came along after the Toltecs. Sitchin also suggests a connection between the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl and the winged serpent of the Egyptians that helps transport the deceased pharaoh heavenward. One of Sitchin's basic theses is that there is a close connection between the gods of ancient Egypt and the gods of Mexico. I was offered another clue to a possible connection between Egypt and Mexico when making the same television program. We drove from La Paz, Bolivia, across the immense plain called the Altiplano, to the ancient city of Tiahuanaco in the Andes. The sacred ruins on 2.5 miles above sea level, but Tiahuanaco was once a port on nearby Lake Titicaca, before some geological upheaval tilted the ground and caused the lake to move a dozen miles away. Lake Titicaca is still full of marine creatures like seahorses, which make it clear that it was once at sea level. Geologists speculate that this was about 100 million years ago, but whatever cataclysm tilted the land and caused Tiahuanaco to cease to be a port must obviously have happened during the history of Tiahuanaco, not in prehistory. Little remains of the great port now except the ruins of the port area, the Pumagate, where giant blocks lay scattered like 9-pins. One of these blocks has a long incision cut by a saw blade that seems to have been made with a diamond-tipped saw. A few hundred yards away are the remains of a vast temple enclosure called the Kalasasaya. In the northwestern corner of this enclosure stands the most famous feature of Tiahuanaco, the Gateway of the Sun, which looks like a miniature Arc de Triomphe. The lintel of the gateway has a crack that runs down to the doorway in its center, but until the 20th century it was more than just a crack. Photographs in Professor Arthur Poznanski's classic book, Tiwanaku, The Cradle of American Man, show it literally torn in two, quite obviously by some convulsion of the earth. As I wandered around the ruins of Tiwanaku, I was struck by the precision of the workmanship. Massive blocks of stones, many weighing more than 100 tons, were carved with such exactitude that a razor blade could not be inserted between the blocks. But where blocks had been separated, as in the Pumapunku, it could be seen that they were often joined by metal clamps, obviously to prevent them coming apart in an earthquake. The archaeoastronomer Professor Neil Steed, who was in the same TV program, examined one of these clamps, roughly 6 inches long and shaped like a capital, and remarked that the builders must have possessed some kind of portable forge. Examination under a microscope has shown that the metal was poured in hot. No sign of any such portable forge have ever been found, yet an open fire would obviously not be hot enough to melt the metal for these clamps, and there are few trees on the Altiplano to provide the fuel. When it came to read Sean Montgomery's account of the Browns gas flame creating a pool of molten metal within seconds, I remembered the metal clamps of Tiwanaku and found myself wondering whether they had been melted in a portable forge, as Steed suggested, or by some device more like the blowtorch seen on the pilaster at Tula. The next sequence of the program found me in Egypt at the Giza site, 50 yards from the Menkaure pyramid. I was filmed examining a wall of precisely carved blocks and pointing out that in Egypt also such blocks have been found to be joined by metal clamps. And as Graham Hancock has pointed out, they can also be found in Angkor Wat in Cambodia. Tiwanaku has one more feature that raises some of the same questions as Tula, a pyramid known as the Akapana. This was once a vast step pyramid with 7 terraces and a flat top that must have looked rather like some industrial complex, or perhaps a modernistic building designed to house common market bureaucrats. It had once dominated the temple area, but 90% of its flat facing stones have been removed over the years by builders, so that what remains looks at first glance like a natural hill. Anyone who clambers to the top finds that it contains a kind of lake. But it was not a hill. Inside it is the Tolan Pyramid. There are tunnels and a chamber of unknown purpose, which one Bolivian archaeologist, Oswaldo Rivera, has referred to as its king's chamber. There had been jointed stone channels to water and had been surrounded by a moat. The large quantities of water that would have fallen on top of the pyramid ran into the central court. Which now looks like a lake. Then into a drainage system that probably ran around all 4 sides of the first terrace to be allowed to emerge into the open. It was then conducted back inside again, then out all the way to the moat. The top was covered with green pebbles looking like the water of the lake, so the whole building was a monument to water. We are reminded of Sitchin's words about Tula and, quote, the remains of the adjoining multi-chambered and multi-storied buildings, which suggest some industrial processing, and raise the possibility that at this site, as at Teotihuacan, some kind of purification and refining process had taken place at a very early period, end quote. As I stood on top of the Akapana pyramid, looking south toward the Quimsachata mountains, then at the vast plain that extended all around me, I found myself trying to imagine what this place had looked like when Tiahuanaco was at the height of its prosperity. It was virtually impossible to conjure up a huge city with a port area constructed of massive blocks, some weighing nearly 200 tons. How did they get them up there, and what was a city doing in the middle of this rather soggy plain? It was obvious that it must have all been quite different, with dozens of small, prosperous villages and plenty of manpower. Then what happened to it? For it was obvious that some great catastrophe had turned it into this barren plain. Above all, when? According to the museum opposite the Kalasasaya and to Alan L. Collada's book, The Tiwanaku, Tiwanaku rose to power around 100 AD, reached its peak around 500 AD, then went into steady decline until about 1000 AD. Yet this raises an obvious question. What, in that case, was the tremendous cataclysm that snapped the gateway of the sun in two and hurled the huge stones of the port all over the place? It was obviously more than a local earthquake, yet there is simply no record of such a cataclysm around 500 AD. Gotta breathe. I find I'm not breathing enough and I start to get droopy toward the end from lack of oxygen. Professor Arthur Poznansky, who spent his life studying the ruins, concluded around the turn of the 20th century that Tiwanaku was founded about 15,000 BC. His reasoning was based on two observation points in the Kalasasaya, which mark the summer and winter solstices. The solstice is the point when the sun is directly overhead, either the Tropic of Cancer or the Tropic of Capricorn, and it is about to turn back and go the other way. At the moment, the two tropics are 23 degrees 30 seconds on either side of the equator. But when the Kalasasaya was built, the tropics were slightly closer to the equator. To be exact, 23 degrees 8 minutes and 48 seconds. This change in the width of the tropics is due to a slight rolling motion of the Earth known as the obliquity of the ecliptic. And this enabled Poznansky to calculate when the Kalasasaya was built. He concluded, as we have seen, that it was around 15,000 BC. Poznansky's dating upset scholars who felt it was thousands of years too early. But between 1927 and 1930, a team of German scientists, led by Dr. Hans Ludendorff of Potsdam, checked Poznansky's results and were inclined to agree with him. However, the academic furor led them to revise their figure downward, and they ended up suggesting that perhaps Tiwanaku might date from 9300 BC. But even this struck archaeologists and historians as 9,000 years too early, and this view, as we have seen, still prevails today. Yet, not entirely, the Mesoamerican archaeologist Professor Neil Steed, who studied Tiwanaku for many years, concluded the sacred city was built about 12,000 years ago, and more surprisingly so does Dr. Oswaldo Rivera, the director of the Bolivian National Institute of Archaeology, who excavated at Tiwanaku for 21 years. This is surprising because in a television program called The Mysterious Origins of Man, made in 1996, Rivera went on record as disagreeing with Steed's estimate. His own view was that the builders of Tiwanaku had simply made a slight mistake. After all, we were only speaking of about 21 seconds of a degree. Steed disagreed. He felt that builders as accurate as the founders of Tiwanaku would not have made even a minor error. During the remainder of 1996, Rivera went on to observe the sunsets over Tiwanaku, which obviously involves taking the measurements from the other end of the Kalasasaya facing west, and his measurement finally convinced him that Steed was right. There was no minor error. The measurements of the sunsets gave precisely the same reading as the sunrises. Rivera came to agree that the Kalasasaya was built 12,000 years ago. In the 1998 interview with Graham Hancock, included in the television series Heaven's Mirror, Rivera even admitted that Tiwanaku must have been built by a lost civilization, and that this civilization could be Atlantis more or less. It would seem that the ideas that Hapgood proposed in 1959, and which geologists ignored as or dismissed, were slowly beginning to make headway. And that is the end of the chapter. Whew. An hour and a quarter. All right. Well, there's some interesting stuff in that. He got away from the narrative of his travels a bit, which was good. I think he droned on a bit too much about Brown's gas. I think he could have kind of cut that down a little bit, trimmed it, but still interesting. I've never heard of Brown's gas. I'd like to do some research on it for sure. And boy, wouldn't that be an interesting thing to be able to get a hold of one of those generators. I would love to do that. But anyway, that is the end of the chapter. We will pick up the next chapter. Let's see, Sunday, because this is Thursday. So I'm going to take a brief break, and then we'll do at least a short Fallout 3 session. I had to stop and think for a minute which game I'm playing. But yeah, so Fallout 3 here in a little bit after I take a quick break and get an adult beverage. So I will see you all in a few minutes. Hopefully not too many of them. If not, if you don't come back or stick around, then have a good night.
Thank you.